Paris on Politics from Fox 32 Chicago.
The famously quiet and circumspect former Speaker of the Illinois House was done in by his words. Mike Madigan's testimony on the witness stand in his own corruption trial proved to be costly. The 50-year wily master of politics and power thought he could outsmart a judge and jury. Perhaps he thought he could come up with the exact right phrasing to avoid perjuring himself on the stand, as he claimed not to be the ringleader in a massive bribery scheme to help ComEd in exchange for no-work jobs for his allies. But Judge John Robert Blakey didn't buy it. Quote, Madigan acted as the central command post for the entire bribery scheme, and if not for his leadership, none of it would have happened, Blakey said. If a defendant decides to take the stand and if he commits perjury, the court can enhance his sentence. And enhance his sentence, the judge did, to 7.5 years in prison, a far longer term than former City Council Dean Ed Burke got for similar corruption schemes. It appears Madigan's disastrous decision cost him years in prison, as Judge Blakey refused to hide his scorn. Quote, it was a nauseating display. You lied, sir. You lied. And you didn't have to. Now, Madigan also maintained his innocence, a calculation that likely cost him even more years in jail. In his brief statement, ostensibly to show contrition, Madigan said, quote, I am most proud of being a good husband, father, and now grandfather. He asked the judge to allow him to spend his final days taking care of his ailing wife and being with his family. The thing is, Madigan would be able to spend time with his ailing wife and family had he shown any remorse, had he decided against testifying, and really, if he had admitted guilt early on and struck a deal with the government. You know, the feds almost never lose these cases. A deal might have netted him a fine and months instead of years in prison. Now he'll be pushing 90 upon his release. Clearly, there was one thing more important than his family to Madigan, and that was his hubris.
Coming up on Paris on Politics.
Tonight, political assassination in Minnesota, a suspect in custody, the Illinois connection, and why political violence is on the rise in the United States.
I'm saying people that are in power right now are abusing it, and all of us can see it.
Plus, going down swinging. Outgoing CPS CEO Pedro Martinez has choice words for the controversial Chicago Teachers Union and Mayor Johnson before leaving Chicago. And ramping up the rhetoric, President Trump threatens to send more ICE agents to Democratic-run cities like Chicago.
This is Paris on Politics from Fox 32 Chicago.
And we're learning more about the alleged shooter in the assassination of a Minnesota Democratic lawmaker and the shooting of another over the weekend. Let's get right to KSMP Twin Cities reporter Soyoung Kim with the very latest. Soyoung, what is the latest?
Paris, it's been an absolutely devastating roughly 48 hours here. Federal prosecutors once again, like you mentioned, calling it a political assassination, echoing the words Governor Tim Walz used previously. But officials also say it's too early to speculate on a motive at this time. First, this is a community and state in mourning, so we want to start by honoring the victims who you should be seeing there. Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark, who were killed, and Senator John Hoffman and his wife Yvette, who are recovering from multiple gunshot wounds and are expected to survive. He was taken into federal custody. Vance Belter was this morning. Acting U.S. Attorney for the Minnesota District announced Belter is facing multiple federal charges, including murder and stalking. He also already faces state charges, including murder and attempted murder. Federal prosecutors sharing new chilling details today, saying he allegedly visited 2 other state lawmakers' homes that morning. And as we've reported previously, investigators say there was a hit list. Authorities reiterated, as horrific as this tragedy is, it could have been even worse.
No exaggeration to say that his crimes are the stuff of nightmares. Belter stalked his victims like prey. He went to their homes, held them out as a police officer, and shot them in cold blood.
And the massive manhunt came to an end near Belter's property in Green Isle late yesterday evening. Investigators had discovered a car that they believed Belter had been driving just a few miles away in that area earlier in the day, also Sunday. Then officials say he was taken into custody fairly quickly after receiving multiple tips. He was seen in a wooded area in Sibley County. He surrendered without incident. There were more than 100 law enforcement officers from multiple agencies, including federal, state, and local resources on this effort. Authorities calling it the largest manhunt in state history. Authorities say they've received hundreds of tips during the course of this search. And perhaps the scariest part of this tragedy may be over, but now there's a long journey ahead of healing and recovery. And of course, as well as this case plays out in court, the next hearing is scheduled for later this month, and he will be held until then. Paris, back to you.
So, Young, there have been talks about the research that Mr. Belter had done on public officials in other states. Do we know how expansive his plans were and what authorities might have stopped?
Yeah, and that list you're referring to, there were notes. Some people had been referring to it as a manifesto, but authorities had clarified not quite a manifesto, but a bunch of notes that they've gathered on notepads, including a list. A lot of Democratic lawmakers, mostly in Minnesota, and other community organizers, but there were several out-of-state and federal lawmakers on that list as well.
All right, So Young Kim, KSMP in the Twin Cities, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And let's turn to a local expert on domestic violence and international violence, political violence as well. That is the head of the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats, Robert Pape, who is joining us via Zoom from Beijing. Robert, thanks for joining us. From what you heard there and what we know about this shooter and this assassination so far, what's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is that Minnesota is just the latest in a string of severe acts of political violence that we've been experiencing in our country for quite some time. You see, Paris, America is on the brink, teetering on a brink of potentially very extreme political violence. Just since Donald Trump took office, we saw Tesla attacks, dozens of them against Tesla stations, Tesla owners, and Tesla dealerships. Then in April, we saw the attack on Governor Shapiro that almost killed him and his family, burned them to death almost while they were sleeping. Then in May, we saw the attack, the murder of the two Israeli staffers who were murdered by a pro-Palestinian activist. And then just in the last week, we saw a flash mob attack, throw rocks, bottles, all kinds of things at ICE agents in Los Angeles. And then, of course, Minneapolis, Minnesota. What we are seeing is a spate and an intense string of political violence. And perhaps even worst of all, we're now starting to see the unity of our country become even less unified. We saw Governor Newsom calling for everyone to stand up against Donald Trump, who is actively dismantling democracy as he spoke. And then just this weekend, we saw hundreds of thousands of Democrats protesting the Trump agenda. At the same time, we saw Donald Trump's military parade, basically a nationalist spectacle of the power of the state. This is not good. And we are teetering on the brink, and we need to take the temperature down.
I need to ask you this aspect of it, Robert. There's a lot of misinformation being spread right now on social media about the shooter, and this is par for the course in these incidents, unfortunately, including by a U.S. Senator, Republican Mike Lee from Minnesota, who's making jokes that claim the suspect is a Marxist. What effect does all this social media misinformation and noise have?
Well, the snarky jokes are actually a way we signal that the political violence is acceptable. You see, you don't, when we talk about support for political violence, and we study this at our center at the Chicago Project on Security and Threats, we find that fully 40% of Democrats in May say they support the use of force to stop the Trump agenda, and 25% of Republicans say they support the use of the military to suppress Democratic protesters against the Trump agenda. Well, what you are seeing is a high degree of acceptance of political violence in our country. And when you see the Senator Lee and the comment, the snarky laughing, this is a way to signal, you know what, wink, wink, this is actually acceptable.
What is it going to take for public officials to take the temperature down that they haven't done already?
Well, we are now in a historic period of, this is not just another set of data points. We need some historic moves by our elected officials. Most important, we need joint statements by the most senior Republican, Donald Trump, and the most senior Democrat, Gavin Newsom, joint statements together condemning political violence. Yes, each of them is separately doing so, and that's a step forward. But now we're teetering on the brink, Paris. We need to step forward and do something we haven't done before. And that would be for President Trump and Gavin Newsom to, in a joint video, stand side by side and condemn political violence wherever it comes from.
At the same time, Robert, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. Just last night, the president issued a statement on Truth Social saying he wants to amp up mass deportations in Democratic-run cities, and then had some choice words for Democratic public officials. Does that add fire to what's already a tinderbox here?
Yes, what we are seeing is, as I said, we are forming now into blocks in our country, and we are mobilizing. This isn't just speech anymore and discourse. And so what you were talking about, both sides are actually mobilizing. Of course, President Trump controls all the guns, so that's a pretty significant fact. But we also need to be calling as citizens for our leaders to stand united against political violence. It is up to the public to tell the leaders what they want, not just to simply say, well, the leader's going to do whatever he's going to do or she's going to do. No, we are a democracy, and in the democracy, the people have the power, but they need to tell the leaders what they really want. And what we want is our leaders to stand united against political violence so our country is not torn apart.
You've studied, conflict zones across the world. What are the parallels that you see here versus what you've studied in some other countries?
Well, the big parallels that I see look more like the former Yugoslavia in the 1980s in Europe. So Yugoslavia was a middle-income country. Nobody thought Yugoslavia would ever have any serious violence. Everybody was too middle class, too happy. They had parties and so forth. Well, then things began to change, and mobilization, blocks began to form, issues over social problems began to become more severe. Leaders began to pour accelerants and gasoline on the fires rather than trying to work together. And before you knew it, things really turned into one of the worst problems of political violence that Europe has had, and that was the Bosnian Civil War. Now, I'm not saying that we're heading to a civil war yet. That's a little too far. What I am saying is we're on the brink of major political violence, and we need then to stand united. We need to recognize that we can do something about this. We don't just have to stand aside and watch our country become more and more torn apart.
All right, Robert Pape, head of the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats. We've talked to you a lot in recent weeks, and I have the ominous feeling we're going to keep talking to you on this very urgent issue. Enjoy your time out in Beijing. Thanks very much.
Thank you for all you do, Paris. Thank you.
You bet. You as well. And President Trump is issuing new threats, as we mentioned, to the city of Chicago and to Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. Late last night, the president posted on Truth Social. He's calling for the largest mass deportation effort in U.S. history, saying he would target Democratic-run cities like Chicago. Today, Governor Pritzker brushed aside concerns the president would call up the National Guard in Illinois.
I think he's seen that this has not gone well for him politically, and he's all about the politics. And so I think what he's done in California has really hurt him politically, and so I don't think he'll do it in other places. But we know that ICE is coming once again in force to cities across the country, and so we expect to see them in Chicago. I don't know exactly how big the force will be, but I do know that he has used other law enforcement along with ICE.
And the president responded while speaking at the G7 summit in Canada. He talked about why he wanted to focus on Democratic-run cities and had some choice words back for Governor Pritzker.
In Chicago, I mean, you got a really bad governor in Chicago and a bad mayor, but the governor's probably the worst in the country, Pritzker. But I look at how that city has been overrun by criminals.
Now, according to the Economic Policy Institute, 2 of the top 3 states for undocumented immigrant population are the Republican-led states of Texas and Florida, but the president didn't mention anything about increased enforcement there. The president also announced a pause on deportation in places like farms, hotels, and restaurants, declaring, in essence, somewhat of a sanctuary for immigrants at those places. And up next, outgoing CPS CEO Pedro Martinez pulls no punches over his thoughts on the Chicago Teachers Union and Mayor Johnson.